So I did things like hire young women to come in and take her to lunch. And I thought, oh, there's got to be something else. Well, then I remembered my mother and dad used to go to the Unity Church in Sacramento, downtown. And I thought, well, I'll find a church and I'll take my mom to church. Well, I looked and looked, and I knew the one downtown wouldn't work because it was much too long a trip on the freeway, and she couldn't do that. So I found a little tiny church up about a 20-minute drive, up in the hills, beautiful country, drove past a gorgeous lake, and we lived in Folsom, California at the time. And we started going to church every Sunday, and it did bring my mother a lot of joy. I just sat there. You have to remember, I wasn't going for me, I was going for my mother. And I didn't pay any attention to what was going on. I wasn't particularly interested until one day I looked up. And I looked and saw the minister, and she was a beautiful woman. Her name was Billy Blaine. And I, for the first time, listened to what she had. And the amazing thing to me was that what she said that Sunday was exactly what I needed to hear in my life that week. And I thought, how did she know I was going to be here? How did she know that that's what I needed to hear for my life that week? Well, there are no accidents. And I can tell you, I've gone to churches of all kinds, all over, everywhere, and every Sunday, whatever message is being delivered is exactly what I need to have that week for my life. The other thing I discovered in that church was a metaphysical bookstore. Now, I'd never been in a metaphysical bookstore before. And so what really surprised me was that there were so many books there that I'd never seen or heard of before. Because I love to read, and I'm one of those people, I'll have a book in the kitchen and two next to my bed and one in the living room, and I'm reading them all at once, and I read. I just love to read. I guess it's not a hobby, it's a vice almost. So when I saw all those books that I'd never seen, I thought, what is this all about? So I started reading through the book, and luckily for me, the minister's husband became my personal librarian. And I'd come every week, he'd recommend a book, I'd read the book, and then we'd talk about it, he'd recommend another. I was on my own Book of the Week club. You cannot read your way through a metaphysical bookstore without having some major changes take place in how your thinking process goes. Because what I study in that bookstore, I study a lot of really easy things. Like, you know, a lot of self-help books like Wayne Dyer and Richard Bach and books, those kind of authors. But I also got pretty much into depth. I started studying about all the great prophets who have come to us to teach us over the ages. And I learned about Judaism, and I learned about Hinduism, and I learned about Baha'u'llah and the Baha'i faith. And I learned about Muhammad and the Islam faith. And I learned about Christianity, and I learned there was this magical golden thread that went through every one of those teachings. And what that thread was, we are all one. We are all one. There's under God, we are all one. And when I studied what Jesus came to teach, what I learned is we are here for one purpose, and that purpose is to love one another. My mother became too ill, and we needed help taking care of her, and so I was invited to move to Santa Rosa, where my daughter was now in practice, and where my daughter and I and my grandchildren's nanny, we could all help take care of her together. And I mean, what a blessing for us that we were able to have my mother all together in our home, and so that she died with her family together. So the minute I hit Santa Rosa, the first thing I had to do was find another church with another metaphysical bookstore that taught a lot of classes. And the first thing I found was a study group for A Course in Miracles. And that became my support group, because A Course in Miracles teaches over and over and over again: forgiveness, forgiveness, forgiveness. And while I was in that class, while I was in that church, I signed up and took all the classes that I could fit into my schedule. One night we were talking about forgiveness, and one of the ladies in the front row raised her hand and she said, "You know, forgiveness isn't real unless you let the person know." And I took quite exception to that, because I thought she meant that I was supposed to forgive the man who murdered Catherine and go and tell him so. And I thought that was just a horrible idea. Why would I want to do that? Because, you see, they did catch the man that murdered Catherine. They did put him on trial. They did find him guilty. And they did put him on death row in San Quentin State Prison in California. And through all of this study, I began to think, well, I think I've forgiven him. But that kind of forgiveness that's intellectual is all up here. It's all in the intellect, and it really doesn't mean a whole lot. I got a letter from a friend who had been with me through all of this process, and it had a clipping, and there was what the clipping said was that an execution of the man who murdered Catherine was being scheduled. And here I am on one side telling people, well, I think I forgave him. And on the other side, I'm getting this notice. I was on the phone to San Quentin demanding that I be given all of the information to be there and that I attend the execution. I called, they said, well, there was a mistake. He isn't really going to be executed. It was just something that an error in the newspaper. But if I would write a letter to the warden and send it, they'd put my name in the file. They would let me know when there was an execution, and I would be invited to come. They would see that the arrangements were made. So I wrote a letter to the warden of San Quentin. I put it on my desk, got in my car, and I went off to my class that night at the church. It was another one of these funny nights, or funny days, or funny feelings, where something was going on. I didn't know what it was, but I had funny feeling all through my body. And I sat through that class, and I was really glad when it was over so I could get out and get my car and go home. About halfway home, I heard a voice. And that voice said to me, "You must forgive him, and you must let him know." And that voice was so loud and so clear and so persuasive, it did not let me sleep that night. It had me out of bed at 4 o'clock in the morning at my computer, typing a letter to the man who murdered Catherine. And in the letter, I told him how much the loss of Catherine had meant to me and my family, and how much we missed her, and how wonderful she had been, and what a precious young woman she was. But then I did say to him that I wanted to let him know that I had come to a point where I could forgive him, and I wanted him to know that. But I made it very clear that this did mean that I thought he was blameless for what had happened. And I said, be sure to know, I will not be a political or social advocate on your behalf. And at the end of the letter I wrote, I would be glad to visit you or to write to you if you would wish. And I took this letter to my class at church, the following class, and I read it to them. And when I was finished reading, all of the class members, or 45 people, had stood, and they were all surrounding me, and they were just pouring their love and their energy into me. And it was because of their loving support that I was able to actually mail the letter.